Another intellectual event organized in the framework of Moscow Urban Forum. My name is Elena Trubina. Some people know me as the author of the book City in Theory. And I am greatly privileged to introduce to you one of the leading urban scholars globally, Steve Graham, whose book about all sorts of verticals we are about to discuss. But let me first say a few words about where Steve works and what else he has written. Stephen Graham works as a professor of cities and societies in the School of Architecture and Planning in Newcastle. He is the author of 7 co-authored, edited, and single-authored books, most of which are translated into 17 languages altogether. And I do hope that Steve's visit to Moscow this July will help us to find a publishing house in Moscow that would be interested in translating this dense but very interesting and important book about verticals into Russian. I also want to say that when it comes to urban studies, it's important to keep in mind that Moscow Urban Forum, very well-known, basically globally known event, mostly brings together the practitioners of all sorts: architects, designers, developers, municipal officials, and so forth. And so the people who sit in front of you, they do something different. They write about cities, they examine cities, they investigate cities. For instance, if the architects dream about getting new lucrative commission and to build yet another ambitious and memorable skyscraper, for people like us and Steve, for mostly, it's important to make sense of why it is exactly that all vertical things provide such enormous appeal to so many people. So urban studies conducted by the people who specialize in urban geography, human geography, and so forth, is the meaning-making field where its representatives try to understand what exactly is happening, what are the fundamental tendencies of today's urban development. I would also like to say that Steve's work strikes me as very multidisciplinary, multifaceted, being an expert in planning, physical geography, a bit of physics, but also human geography and urban geography, and a very rapidly growing field which is called social studies of science and technology. Steve is able to put his expertise in use and to come up with very wide-ranging, profound, general, universal, if you wish, descriptions of today's development. So he's a synthesizer. He's the one who is able to see the connections between things some other people are not able to perceive. And this results in his diverse body of work. He is the author of a very famous book which is called Splintered Urbanism, and some other books dealing with militarization of urban development, securitization of urban development, the connection between physicality and materiality of city, and its kind of digitalization, the ubiquitous information communication technologies. And so this ability to work between the disciplines, look to repeat for connections other people are not able to see, made Steve who he is, a very famous scholar who enjoys quite a demand. And so without further ado, I begin our questions and answers session, and we'll allocate some time in the end of our conversation so that thank you so much for coming, by the way, we're able to ask your questions as well. And so my first question is about a tricky relationships between downward verticality and upward verticality. In the book, you speak quite a lot about different holes that people drill in Earth, whether it's ultra deep mines, whether it's kind of basements that they use for construction and so forth. But I think you're totally right when you say that it's upward verticality that fascinates people most. And so my first question is about possible reasons why it is so, why people are so inclined to look up rather than look down.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Elena, and very nice to see everybody here this afternoon. Hello. I would start by saying that the skyscraper is spectacular and visible, even when it has the weird multicolored sky that seems to have come to the back of the Seven Sisters here. Excuse the quality of the slides. Cities, if you like, have very deep root systems underneath the ground. Many cities go underneath and into the subterranean space as deeply as they do go into the above ground space. But of course, the very spectacular constructions of skyscrapers have always held a profound and a deep fascination. It's a fascination to do with how they are awe-inspiring, how they overcome gravity in ways that seem to defy the very forces of the earth, and the way they are designed to be sublime, to be combinations of awe and terror sometimes. They intimidate. They provide astonishment, especially to people who are coming to the big city, who are drawn to the big city, but are not used to those building forms. So the skyscraper is one of the few building forms which only really exists in the big city. And they are being used and built in most extraordinary ways around the world these days because of the way they operate as symbols of centrality, symbols of wealth, symbols of power, but also symbols of astonishing architectural and engineering achievements.
This morning, we went for a walk. And predictably enough, we ended up at the panorama desk at the Federation Tower. So we were able to admire vast Moscow landscapes and very impressive bunch of skyscrapers that one can see from above. We particularly like the one that has the shape of a spiral. Very elegant, very clever. And my next question is about a specific photograph that remains quite popular in Runet among many Russians who are interested in design, architecture, urban development. And on this photograph, I'm not even sure whether this is collage or it's taken from from particular place. There is a very striking juxtaposition of Moscow Central Business District, comprised from the skyscrapers that I already mentioned, and the surrounding neighborhood. So the Central Business District skyscrapers are depicted as shiny, glamorous, fantastic, phantasmagoric even, drawing all attention that there is. And surrounding neighborhood is depicted as, you know, normal, dark, a bit bleak. There is nothing interesting about it. And so I sent this photograph to Steve, and my question to you is whether would you say that this juxtaposition of shiny skyscrapers and bleak surroundings is typical for many cities, or are we talking about something specific to Moscow?
Well, I think the origins, we have to look here at the origins of the skyscraper as a building form and as an architectural form, which goes back to a very heavy level of competition between Chicago and New York during the latter part of the 19th century. And it was there that the struggle to build high became symbolic of the city, and the obsession with the idea of a skyline, the idea of seeing the city as a series of towers organized in a particular way became an emblem of cities. what's very powerful now is that many cities around the world where real estate interests and architectural competitions and often local government elites we can talk about later, there's an aspiration for skylines that mimic the American tradition but reinvent it in new ways. So the skyscraper skyline is now being generalized around the world in all sorts of very interesting ways, but the buildings are being built are very different. But in all cases, there is always this radical contrast between the small concentration of super high towers, and they are now reaching the first kilometer skyline is going up in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, as we speak, and the radical horizontality of the rest of the city. So there are all sorts of questions socially, politically, environmentally, about how to reconcile those things so that it's not a situation where the powerful elite interests dominate over the rest of the city in terms of physical, social, or political or financial systems. Yeah.
Actually, my next question is exactly the powerful elite which you mentioned. In principle, when you think how to build a memorable structure, how to make this ambitious gesture, and to construct what's called iconic edifice, iconic building or object, you can think of many ways of doing so. People build bridges, people build libraries, people build waterfronts or refurbish existing ones, people build concert halls, and so forth. And yet, there is a specific appeal that exactly these skyscrapers have for urban elites and for the national elites. So I'm wondering, why does it happen that when it comes to making a powerful and ambitious geopolitical gesture, the elites of totally different countries, beginning from United Emirates and ending with here, resort to constructing skyscrapers?
I think that's a really important question, because the skyscraper is a very visible and obvious demonstration of arrival. It's a symbol or a logo of a powerful city, and what geographers and urbanists call a global city. A global city is a city where control centers are concentrated, where the global flows and economics of development are decided. Global cities are now symbolized by the sorts of towers we're seeing behind us. There's a sense amongst planning and government elites that unless you have a skyline of towers, you can't really be seen to be perceived to be a global city. But it goes more than that, because these days the towers are being shaped in all sorts of interesting ways to be, as you say, distinctive. There's only so many ways in which you can design a silo. Architects are putting in a lot of work, as you can see with these images, to make each silo different from the others. So that each city will have its distinctive image of the tower. So the Burj Dubai is a classic example of how a flat, relatively unspectacular cityscape in Dubai has been rebranded, has been re-imaged, has been remade as a global destination. And you see that building everywhere. It's on science fiction movies. It represents the future in many sci-fi movies. It's in advertisements. It's in place marketing brochures. It's in everything you ever see. To say, what it says is, this is the logo for Dubai. And other structures cannot perform that role nearly as easily because they're not right up there in the sky. It's as simple as that. You cannot miss these things, and that's their entire point, right?
In the book, you address quite many technical questions. And what I like about there are many things to like about this book, but I admired how wittily you speak about many absurd moments behind the skyscraper construction. And one of them even received a specific term. It's vanity height, namely the distance between the last occupied or used floor in the skyscraper and its very top. And it keeps growing, this specific part of the skyscraper. And so this is going to be a philosophical question. And Stephen's book is filled or full of philosophy, I would say. So my question is about specific relationship, specific dialectic between rational aspects and irrational aspects in the ways we perceive skyscrapers. Some of you construct skyscrapers, but also in the ways skyscrapers are being used.
I think there's a fascinating set of questions here. On the one hand, of course, cities are growing fast in many parts of the world. Populations of cities are growing fast. Land availability is pretty much constant, although land itself is being manufactured in a lot of littoral waterfront cities now. So there is an argument that is being made by a lot of urbanists and urban economists and so on, that to accommodate the urban future, we need to urbanize the sky. And that's a fair argument. If you take the point of we have to build what the philosopher Henri Lefebvre called stacked societies. These are societies where we increasingly are stacking many uses on top of each other in our dense, growing and congested cities. These are uses that go down into the ground, uses that go up into the sky, uses that are above the cities in terms of orbital space, airspace and so on. So that's a fair point. But on the other hand, there are the aspects of skyscraper construction that are about vanity, that are about the so-called race between buildings and the elites and nations and cities they represent to be the highest. And this is a very interesting story too. There's a long history here of building high to represent power and prestige. Before skyscrapers were around, it was about European cathedrals and ancient Egyptian pyramids and so on. For a long time, the tallest building in the world was Lincoln Cathedral in England, and that was a source of enormous prestige to the bishops of that time. So this is nothing new. What is new is this sense of using the most extraordinary innovations of architecture and engineering to push ever more higher towers. And as I say, the tallest towers now that are going beyond the 828 meters of the Burj Dubai are now bridging the kilometer barrier. Another very prestigious moment. But as you say, a lot of these towers reach heights against predictions that they will accommodate a lot of people. A lot of these towers do not accommodate large numbers of housing units for large populations. A lot of them are full of very small numbers of very big apartments. These days, skyscrapers are less and less commercial space. They're more and more hotel space, viewing space, residential space. Often the residential space is not even occupied because the owners are using it as an asset to be invested in from a large distance. So you have the vanity height as well, and the vanity height, as you say, is the tower space at the top of the usable space that just perhaps has an elevator shaft or the infrastructural sinews of the tower, and it's purely there to get high. Okay, it's purely there to get in the record books or to create this very unique silhouette. And the vanity height in the tallest building in the world at the moment, the Burj Dubai, is 240 meters or so. It's purely a spire to make it the tallest. I think in Europe that would be in the top 30 tallest buildings if it was taken away. So I think we have to be I mean, I'm coming this from a critical social science perspective. We have to look at the arguments that we need to build high and build dense, and we have to be shown that they are true. We have to evaluate them and perhaps then question, why do we need all of these vanity height if we're simply about accommodating housing for overpressed populations?
Since we are discussing technicalities of sorts, I am reminded of the conference I took part. It was quite a while ago, in 2006. It took place in Darmstadt, and it was called Negotiating Urban Conflicts. And Peter Marcuse was taking part in this conference, and he was talking about skyscrapers. And I think it was the first time in my kind of professional life that I heard this point from him, that it's kind of quite remarkable that in order to take part in this competition, the designers and developers have to allocate more and more space for the elevators. And so as a result, we end up watching and looking at some of these spectacular buildings, which are basically, that's the sense I got based on your book and his earlier comments, is that we're basically looking at the spectacular buildings filled often with nothing but elevators.
I think the elevator is a fascinating object, something we tend to take for granted, okay? When do you ever think about the history and the technology of the elevator when you get into the elevator? It's often very banal and very, very sort of forgotten. But the history of the elevator is obviously absolutely pivotal to the history of vertical cities and vertical buildings, and also vertical mining. And we should stress that the deepest mines in the world go down into the ground 4 times as deep as the biggest skyscrapers go high. But it's a process, as you said, that we're not really seeing because it's so invisible. So the elevator is really important to the latest skyscrapers, because you cannot have a functioning skyscraper if the elevators are not fast enough, are not efficient enough for taking the people in and out. This is particularly the case with commercial buildings, where you need a lot more elevators than you do with residential. That's one of the reasons residential skyscrapers make economic sense, because you need less space for the elevators in terms of the demand for use. But the latest engineering predictions are that it's the elevators that are the constraints for the next round of super tall towers. The building technology, the material science, and the engineering is there to go up to 1.5 kilometers now, okay? What is limiting it is the technology and especially the weight of the elevator systems. But some of the big elevator companies, they now have their own elevator research towers in places like Tokyo and Helsinki, where they are now crashing through that technological barrier. And Kone, the Finnish elevator company, are especially important here because they are now using carbon fiber for the rope systems that go up to 500 meters or a kilometer. And obviously carbon fiber is a great deal lighter and stronger than steel, which will facilitate this next burst of competitive vertical construction.
It would be perhaps a bit of a jump, but I now want to talk about something totally different, namely cultural representations of different verticals. And obviously, many people in the audience remember these wonderful films, beginning from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, one of the earliest depictions of this verticality, workers down there, elite up there. And one is also reminded about Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. And there is a sense in which these films, in a kind of predicted this stacked city, vertical city, multi-layer city. And so my question to you is as follows. When it comes to the most recent cultural representations, whether these are films or novels or perhaps computer games, can you name one or a few which you find particularly symptomatic?
Wow, it's difficult to find one particular example, but I think as you said, here's a couple of more historic examples. This is J.G. Ballard, the famous science fictional dystopian novelist from the UK in the 1970s, who did a fabulous novel depicting the sort of risks and the pathologies that might exist in vertical living. And it goes into this tradition where the vertical is seen to be the future. And ever since the origins of science fiction, way back in the 19th century, people like H.G. Wells, when they were talking about the future, they would use the massively accelerated vertical city to symbolize the future. And that is a standard trope, standard tradition in science fiction. And it, as you say, it's a symbol of Fritz Lang's incredible work, Metropolis, in 1929. And he went to New Manhattan on a ship and was awe-inspired by this sublime world of technology and verticality. And that very much inspired Metropolis, which, as you say, used the vertical city to sort of signify and symbolize the extreme class differences of Weimar Germany. He had the tiny elite living in the garden of earthly delights at the top of the tower, the people who create the city. Just as J.G. Ballard had the architect for his tower living at the top. And the workers in Metropolis, I'm sure you've seen it. If you haven't, you really have to, were sustaining the city in the spaces below ground. And this model of development, I'm afraid, seems very relevant to the real ways in which skyscrapers are often being constructed. For example, in the Gulf. You know, you have the bonded laborers brought in from Nepal, South India, and Pakistan, who are working in terrible conditions, often lethal conditions, to sustain the garden of earthly delights for the new urban elites. And I think one of the great challenges we have is to build again a more democratic and socialized sense of urban vertical living, which manages to steer away from these more worrisome trends. In terms of more recent images of verticality, what I'm interested in is the sort of retro futurism of much of this stuff. What we mean by retrofuturism is that these are not necessarily based on images of the future. These are based on historic images of the future, particularly from the USA in the 1950s and 60s. And the reason I say that is that the guy who designed the set for Blade Runner, this is good timing, a guy called Sid Mead, he calls himself a visual futurist, which is very interesting. He turned a set in LA that was based on Manhattan into a putative future for LA too. LA was going to be the future. It was this oriental future. Anyhow, Sid Mead now goes round the cities of the Gulf, Bahrain, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc. And he does lectures to the elites of the city about how they can look like the future, okay? And they want to look like the future. And William Gibson, who's the author of many of the cyberpunk novels, not this particular one, which was Philip K. Dick, but if you've read Neuromancer and some of these 1980s images of a technological future, William Gibson said, and this is a wonderful quote, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." Okay. What the skyscraper industries are trying to do is to build pockets of the future as part of the wider aspirational, and that's another vertical word, strategies of real estate companies, developers, architects, and so on.
when we walked around central business district, as I already mentioned, we passed by one wall covered by glass, but behind this wall there was a kind of skillful imitation of whatever you think it is, kind of forest. It was all green. And this prompts me to ask the question about the ongoing discussions of sustainability of skyscrapers. People talk about gardens in the sky. People talk about wooden skyscrapers. There is, in one of the slides, you did show Shanghai Tower, which China boasts about a great deal as being the most green skyscraper you can think about. And the question which arises here is about the connection among skyscrapers and climate change. So what's your take on it?
Well, this is again a great question. Again, the arguments are hard to deny that if we build high and we fill our buildings with dense urban populations, we will hopefully create more walkable, more sustainable urban centers and reduce the tendencies towards ex-urban sprawl, organized around automobiles and so on. So that theoretically could help the financial health of municipal governments and create a virtuous circle of dense urbanism, the compact city as it's been traditionally called. So I'm not in any way denying that can be achieved. But again, I need to be stressing that, there is a lot of what's called greenwash around in the skyscraper industries. Greenwash is attempts to overlook or to obscure non-sustainable aspects of urban life by portraying them as green. And there's a great example in the south of London at the moment, which is one of the big new expensive luxury towers of South London, and it has 3 tiny little wind turbines in the roof as a sort of gesture towards greenness, right? We can build much more sustainable cities and much more sustainable architectures based on a lot of the technologies that we were hearing about before in terms of recycled water systems and rainwater capture and renewable energies and all of the obvious things. And many of the claims amongst skyscraper developers to be green are somewhat dubious sometimes. For example, they don't look at the full costs of the materials that are going into the construction of the towers. Often they might look just at the energy loads for the operation of the towers. Many of the materials that go into tower constructions are very, very demanding in terms of energy and water footprints, for example, aluminium, for example, steel, and so on. Many of them are brought huge distances because of the particular demands of concrete construction. The latest towers now use high-tech concrete as the load-bearing structures rather than the more traditional steel frame construction. And the amazing example I have there is that the Burj Dubai in Dubai had to draw sand from Australia as the basis for the concrete construction because the sand in the desert around Dubai, which is, quite prevalent, there's quite a lot of it, as you can imagine, is actually the wrong type of sand. It's too rounded and it's too salty and it doesn't cohere into the very specialist concrete. So many of the energy and resource footprints that actually go into building these towers are far from sustainable, are embedded in deep mining industries which have very problematic environmental footprints in all sorts of complex ways and social impacts as well in the areas of resource extraction. So I think if we're going to look at much more sustainable urbanism, we have to connect the buildings up into the sky with the much more hidden worlds of resource extraction, which we know so little about, but rely on completely.
Yeah, as you spoke, I was reminded about the exhibition that is currently on in Foyle's bookshop in London, which is again about green skyscrapers, and they also advertise this Shanghai Tower. And the feeling I had about this exhibition is that this kind of greening of skyscrapers contributes to the general sense of coolness behind skyscrapers, made them trendy, make them exciting. And so one ends up thinking that all good words you can think about, sustainability, resilience, efficiency, but also a bit of luxury, get lumped together when it comes to skyscrapers.
Yeah, I mean, this shift from commercial skyscrapers to residential skyscrapers, and this is a very important economic transformation in the role of the skyscraper in cities. It's less and less about corporate headquarters that are a symbolic tower to represent the corporation, which was the history of the 20th century skyscraper in New York and Chicago. More and more, it's a real estate device to add value to luxury living in the sky. It's what architects call the logic of luxury. And what you're using to add value to that, the sky, is the view. You know, the ultimate sales pitch is this extraordinary sense of being released from the ground to inhabit the sky and sometimes the edge of the city or the ocean city, and to look over and look beyond and look below at the rest of the city. That's the edge that makes the premium of the logic of luxury so important. And of course the other things in terms of quality design, in terms of nice materials, the interior fitments have to be suitably luxurious in terms of the right brands and so on. And sometimes the greening, as you say, just becomes a sort of wash over that surface of luxury living.
What I genuinely admire about your work is how brave you are in terms of touching sometimes not particularly comfortable, flattering aspects of urban life. All your work on militarization of urban development and secularization and surveillance. And I like how in the book that we are discussing here, you address a specific transfer of many useful things, technologies and gadgets from military use towards civilian use. And of course, Google Earth provides one of the striking examples of that. What emerged as a military invention became the thing that we use every day. When we plan our vacation in Thailand, when we decide where to go, and so forth. And so this is a bit of a personal question. How do you use Google Earth, if ever?
Oh, well, I'm a bit of a Google Earth addict, actually. Anyone who's interested in geography and urbanism and technology and science cannot really ignore Google Earth. It's a fascinating set of systems that really are reinventing how we're living in so many ways, together with GPS, of course, which is the parallel system. And as you say, these systems were put in place initially by the US military, along with many other systems put in place by other militaries, the Russian and the Soviet militaries as well, of course, as part of the Cold War, as an attempt to spy on the surface of the Earth with ever more power, but also to navigate and target the Earth through missile strikes and so on. But the way in which Google Earth has been democratized is astonishing, you know? Only 20 years ago, those technologies would have been deeply, deeply secret. So to have those things in your pocket, continually allowing this sense of global navigation, global visual experience is incredible. So on the one hand, for cities and for urbanists, it's a way of tracking these enormous landscapes we call cities. Cities everywhere in the world are going way beyond any traditional small-scale model of a landscape or of a settlement which can be easily understood. They are becoming whole regions, whole nations, whole networks across transnational landscapes. And as the architect Lars Lerup says, he's an architect based in Texas, you know, for a city to exist, it needs its eyes. And in a way, the only way we can understand our cities now and our urban landscapes is through Google Earth. You can really understand how the sprawl changes the landscapes and so on. And then you can start to understand the politics and the social aspects of these changes too. This is being used by a lot of social groups around the world for tracking human rights abuses, for keeping track of police forces, in terms of drones anyway. The drone is another interesting example of a military technology that's now civilianized, and it's so cheap you can give your child a 40 quid one for Christmas, $400 ruble one for Christmas. The way in which Google Earth is now changing the politics of cities is interesting. For example, in Bahrain, in the uprisings that accompanied the so-called Arab Spring, was that 2011? I forget the year. The trigger for that was an image from Google Earth, which is remarkable. Bahrain is an island, and it's controlled by a very small Shia elite, I always forget which is Shia or Sunni. Excuse me if I get this wrong. But the majority population got an image of the island city, and they saw all of the new land that has been made. One of the interesting questions about Google Earth is the way it's prompting cities to make new islands, to make new shapes, to make new landscapes that look cool from Google Earth, okay? The Palm and the World in Dubai are the famous examples, but around the world we're seeing so many new island landscapes. This is a process where you take the sand off the base of the ocean. This is one of the reasons Dubai doesn't have enough sand, because it's put it all in the world and the palm. But anyway, the majority's population in Bahrain then went into an uprising because they saw they were being distanced from their own coasts. These new spaces were private, they were being built for real estate interests and so on. So there is a sense of the new view from above being a new way of inscribing the experience of urban life, but also struggles over who shapes and controls urban life, which I think is really important.
So the organizers wave the reminder about time to us, and with this we have to conclude our interview. And in case some of you have questions, let's just go over there, have some tea or water, and chat for a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena.